Thank you so much for joining me on your very first brew day. I'm stoked that you're interested in the art of homebrewing and you are ready to make your very first beer. Before we get started, let's go through what I have in front of me. These are the very bare bones equipment needs and ingredients that you'll need for your very first beer. Let's start here with our boil kettle. We're going to be making a very small 2-gallon batch of beer today because that 2-gallon batch of beer is going to fit nicely in our Coldbreak ColdOne that we're going to be bringing to a party in a couple weeks. This 5-gallon kettle is a perfect size because it's big enough to hold all the beer that we're going to be boiling today, but it's also small enough to fit on top of our stove, which will be our heat source. Next, we have our 3-gallon fermenter. This is where, at the end of the brew day, our beer will go into before we add the yeast. The yeast job, we always say that we make craft beer, but actually, we just make wort. Wort is a sugary liquid. The yeast is the one that converts that sugary liquid into alcohol. So, in regards to that, the yeast is what is making the beer. This contraption over here is called a wort chiller. Now, this is an optional piece of equipment, but I highly, highly recommend it because at the end of our boil, we're going to need to cool that beer down before we can pitch the yeast. The yeast is very sensitive to a certain temperature range, and we're going to take it from 212 degrees down to about 68 degrees before we can add our yeast to start the fermentation process. Now, in front of me, we also have probably one of the most important things that every brewer needs and uses, and this is sanitizer. We'll get into the specifics of this later, but anything that touches your beer after you're done boiling it has to be sanitized, whether it's a spoon, a thermometer, or a hydrometer when you're taking your gravity readings. Now in front, I said we're gonna brew a simple 2-gallon batch today, and we're gonna be making a Simcoe IPA. We're making an extract beer, so we're gonna be using liquid malt extract. This recipe calls for 3.3 pounds because we're only making a 2-gallon batch. We're gonna be using 2 ounces of Simcoe hops, and we have some additional ingredients at the end. A Whirlfloc tablet for clarity, a little bit of FirmCap, which if you're brewing on your stove, this is a lifesaver. And some yeast nutrient just to give the yeast a special boost before we start brewing. All right, let's head on over and get the process started. Welcome back. Like I said, my name is Steve, but my friends and fellow homebrewers call me Morin G. In this series, we're going to explore the wonderful world of craft beer, and more specifically, homebrewing. I'm going to share my love and experience with this amazing hobby, and hopefully, along the way, teach you some tips and tricks so that you too can start creating your own craft beer. Now, you may be wondering, why would I want to make my own beer when there are plenty of local breweries nearby? You know what the old saying is, give a man a beer, he'll waste an hour, but teach a man to brew, he'll waste a lifetime. All kidding aside, whether this is your first brew day or you've been brewing for years like me, let's get started so the next time you show up to the party with beer, you can brag to all your friends that you made it. There are 4 main ingredients in every beer that you drink: water, grain, hops, and yeast. Now, throughout the brew day, I'm going to be mentioning different stages of the brewing process. I created this simple, quick little cheat sheet of the brewing process, and it is linked in the video below if you want to read up on each stage and the expectations for each stage. So stage number 1 is adding the water to our boil kettle. We're going to be making a small 2-gallon batch, but we're going to start with 2.5 gallons of water. Because throughout the brewing process, as we're boiling, we're going to lose some of that volume to evaporation, and then during the fermentation process, as the yeast is converting that wort, as we call it, into alcohol, when that's all done, there will be some leftover yeast cake on the bottom that we want to keep out of our finished clean beer. So let's add 2.5 gallons of water to our boil kettle and get that heated up. All right, so our water is in our boil kettle here and it's heating up. We got the temp cranked all the way up, got a thermometer there, keeping our eye on it. We're gonna heat this water all the way up to 212 degrees to get it boiling before we add in our liquid malt extract. Now, 2 terms that you're gonna hear a lot as a brewer, especially if you're just starting out, is, are you an extract brewer or are you an all grain brewer? The second and most important ingredient in the brewing process is grain. The grain is going to be adding color, flavor, and most importantly, the food source that the yeast will be eating to convert into alcohol. What we call this food source before we add the yeast is wort. Now, today we're making an extract brew. So this is liquid malt extract. Basically what has happened is we're taking the grains that are typically used to extract the sugars off of, and we're skipping that whole process, and we're using a condensed liquid malt extract syrup. So inside here, this is called Golden Light. I'll take the lid off here and I'll try to give you a view of it. So that's what the lid looks like. But inside here, we have basically a syrup, which is just loaded full of sugar. It's actually pretty tasty if you taste it. It's very, very sweet. But this is going to be the food source that the yeast will be converting into alcohol. But we've got to boil it. We've got to add extra ingredients. Now, when you first open up one of these containers, it's going to be very thick and sticky. Okay? So a helpful tip is to get a pitcher of very hot water, and while your water is heating up here, take this and set it in the water so that that liquid, that syrup on the inside can loosen up. As soon as our water is up to temperature, we'll add that in and we'll continue the brew process. All right, it looks like our water is heated up to temperature. So before we add in our extract, what we're gonna do first is we're gonna turn the heat off completely. What that's gonna do is allow our liquid malt extract to stir and mix in without burning on the bottom of the pot. I made that mistake once. I left the flame on, direct on the bottom of the kettle. As I added in the syrup, it quickly fell to the bottom and a portion of that liquid malt extract scalded and burnt and left a really kind of toasted, crispy, unwanted off flavor in the beer that I was making. So remember that. If you're adding extract in, especially if it's liquid extract, you want to turn the heat off first before adding that in. All right, so let's grab our extract. We've had it heated up in that water in the sink, so it should be pretty loose and ready to add and pour in. As we pour this in, we are going to grab our spoon and we are going to stir it in as we add it to this 212 degree boiling water. Look at that, beautiful. Now this liquid malt extract is called Golden Light, but as you can see, it is a pretty brown caramel color that we're adding in. Now that's about all of it, but being the good Dutchman that I am not going to let any of this extra liquid malt extract behind in this container. So I'm going to grab a spatula and I'm going to scrape out every single drop of this that I can get. All right, so we got all of our liquid malt extract added in. We stirred it around to make sure it's all blended and mixed in with our water. And what I like to do is I like to kind of scrape my spoon here in the bottom of the pot. I'm going to pull it up and I'm just going to look to see if there's any of that syrup stuck on the bottom of the pot. When my spoon comes up nice and clean, I know it's thoroughly mixed in and I won't have any burning or scalding of that as I turn the kettle back on. But before we do that, I'm going to give you the absolute most important tip of the day. Before we turn the heat back on and before we start boiling this, let me tell you about this lifesaver. This is called FirmCap. What FirmCap is, it's a foam reducer. So when you start to boil this sugary water now, it's gonna foam up right away. And if you're brewing on your kitchen stove, the last thing you want, especially if you're married, is to have a boil over and an absolute mess everywhere. Again, I learned that the hard way. So this FirmCap is only a couple dollars and it's a lifesaver. You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it at your local homebrew shop as well. So all you need to do is just add in a few drops of this. I usually add in about 4 or 5. And what that's going to do as the wort starts to boil and want to foam up, this foam reducer, it's got some super long scientific name, is going to break down that foam and keep it from boiling over. So let's turn our heat back on and get this baby boiling. All right, as you can see, we got a nice rolling boil started. We're gonna keep our heat turned all the way up to keep that nice rolling boil going on for the next hour. So for the next hour, we're gonna boil our wort and we're gonna add in the hops. So most hop bittering additions start at 60 minutes. What that does is it takes all of the oils and the acids out of the hops. The longer you boil the hops, the more bitterness you get out of the acids that are in the hops. So we're using 1 ounce of Simcoe hops, which have a 12.5% alpha acid percentage on here. So we're gonna cut this open and we're gonna add in 1 ounce of Simcoe hops into our wort. We're just gonna dump them right on in there. And as you can see, it's gonna start to boil up right away. But thankfully, we put that FirmCap in. So even with adding the hops in, we're not gonna get a boil over. You can see a little bit of the hop material kind of collecting here on the side. So I'm just gonna use my spoon and stir that in. You're gonna get a great aroma from those hops, a great citrus, piney aroma coming off as they're boiling. We're gonna set our timer right up here for 55 minutes. Actually, no, we're gonna set it for 45 minutes, and I'll tell you why here in a second. So we're gonna set our timer for 45 minutes because the next step that we have to do in the boil process is gonna come with 15 minutes to go. So if we take 15 minutes off of an hour, that leaves us with 45 minutes. So 45 minutes on the clock until our next step. So we're about halfway through the boil process. I sat down because I'm gonna prepare for the next steps in the brewing process, and I just scanned over the recipe and realized I made a mistake, or as I like to call it, a happy accident. Thanks, Bob Ross. I added in a full ounce of Simcoe hops at 60 minutes when the recipe only called for half of an ounce. So what did I just do? I doubled the amount of bitterness that I'm going to boil out of those hops. Fortunately for me, we're making an IPA where bitterness is good. So our total IBUs, or bitterness, that we're gonna have in this beer now is gonna be up around 80 to 90 IBUs. It's gonna be a pretty bitter IPA, but it's still gonna be really tasty. That last half ounce that we're supposed to add at the end of the boil, we're gonna save that for the dry hop. Let's talk now about sanitation. Anything that touches the beer after the boil process is over has to be sanitized. So our Star San is our sanitizer. There's directions right on the back of how to mix this. This is a very concentrated sanitizer. You only need to use 1 ounce of the Star San for 5 gallons of water. So what we're gonna do is we're going to put about probably 2 gallons worth of water and maybe I don't know, about a quarter to a third of an ounce of Star San in here. Because in our fermenter is where the beer is going to go in order to ferment out and turn into alcohol. So we're gonna put Star San in this because the beer is gonna touch it. We're also going to soak our wort chiller here in Star San because we're gonna use this when the beer is done to cool it down. I also like to take some of the Star San that I mix up and put it in a spray bottle. If at any time there's anything that I want to use to touch the beer after it's done boiling, whether it's a spoon or a graduated cylinder or my hydrometer, which I'm gonna take some gravity readings with, I can have some sanitizer on hand and I can spot spray it really quick. So remember, anything that touches the beer after the boil is done has to be sanitized. So we're gonna get this prepared and get that all set up and ready to go. And we're ready for our next step here in a little bit on our boil. All right, we've been boiling our wort here for 45 minutes. You can see the rolling boil still going on. You can see the hop matter from that initial hop addition there kind of floating off to the side. And you can also see, if you look at the side of the kettle, of how much is kind of evaporated off already. We've probably lost about a half a gallon of total volume. So with 15 minutes to go, we are gonna add in a Whirlfloc tablet. What a Whirlfloc tablet will do will help clarify the beer to give us a cleaner, clearer looking beer after fermentation. So Whirlfloc has an ingredient in it called Irish moss. Some brewers just use Irish moss, but a Whirlfloc tablet, it's an easy thing to put in your beer. Now, if you're specifically making a hazy IPA, then you don't want to add that in because you want that haze to come through in your beer. But this is a more traditional West Coast IPA, so we're going to put that Whirlfloc tablet in there to help it give it that more clean, clear, commercial look when we're all done. All right, we're almost to the end of our boil. We've got a few seconds left here. And there's the timer. We're going to shut the timer off and we are going to turn the heat off. So now the next step after we're done boiling, so the boil process is complete. So anything that touches the beer now has to be sanitized. I can't stress that enough. The next step now is to chill this 212 degree liquid down to about 68 degrees. That is the optimal temperature that we want for our yeast to ferment the beer. So there's many different ways of chilling this beer down. We're going to use a copper coil wort chiller today, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. If you don't have one of those, the most basic and easy way to do this is to create an ice bath in your sink or in a big tub. Create a really cold ice bath, take the whole boil kettle and set it in there. Now, it's going to take probably anywhere up to an hour for that liquid to cool down to the temperature that you want. But if you don't have the means of using a wort chiller or any other way, then that's the way you do it. I've done it before when I first started brewing and it works. It just takes a lot more time. The other thing you can do is at the start of the brew day, instead of adding the entire volume of water into your boil kettle, you can add in half of the amount of water and take the other half of water and keep it chilled in your refrigerator. Now, what's going to happen is at the end of your boil, your numbers, if you're trying to take gravity readings, are going to be very elevated because you've concentrated that wort down because you've only used half of the water. But what you can do at the end, you can use that chilled water in your refrigerator, add it to this to get to your total volume, and at the same time, you're adding in 37 degree water, which is going to drop that temperature down right away too. You still might have to chill it a little bit more to get it to 68, but I've done that process before too. I highly recommend though, you buy yourself a copper wort chiller. Okay, I'm going to show you in a minute how you can hook that up to either your faucet if you have the correct fittings for your faucet, or even to your garden hose out in your garage, and chill this down in less than 5 minutes. Let's go check it out. All right, so the boil is complete. Now we need to chill this 212 degree down to about 68 degrees to give the yeast the optimal temperature to ferment. So what I'm going to be using today is this copper wort chiller. I have it hooked up to my garden hose, so I have really cold faucet water running through one way of the coil, and then I'm going to be using that and shaking it up and down inside of here. And as that water travels through those coils, that copper is going to extract the heat from the wort and cool it down very quick. So I got my thermometer on here, and I'm going to get going with this. It's all sanitized. I had it in some sanitizer in the bucket. Everything touching the beer now has to be sanitized. So we're going to put this in, and we're going to start shaking away. All right, we're back inside. We got our chilled wort. It actually took less than 5 minutes. The more you shake, the more you stir, the more heat you can extract from the wort and cool it down faster. So it took about 4.5 minutes, kind of a new record for me. But again, this is a really small batch. So the larger volumes you have, if you're brewing a 5-gallon batch or a 10-gallon batch, it is going to take longer to chill it. But for this little 2-gallon batch, 4.5 minutes, that's pretty awesome. Now, all we need to do now is add this into our fermenter. As you can see, I added a strainer here too, to the top. We still have a lot of hop matter and what they call a hop trube that's floating around in here. And I'm trying to make the cleanest, clear IPA that I possibly can. So I sanitize my strainer. I'm gonna just dump this carefully right through the top of the strainer into the fermenter, and then we'll be ready to pitch the yeast. All right, so we've reached that last step, every brewer's favorite step, time to pitch the yeast. We got our wort chilled down to about 66 degrees. As you can see, we filled up our fermenter. I used that strainer to get a lot of that hop trube from going into the beer. You're gonna notice down here in the bottom, it's still gonna look a little funky and gross, but that's what it's supposed to look like. We call that the Coldbreak, all right, which our company is named after. All this foam on top, I gave it a good shake a couple times because we added oxygen into the wort. Before the fermentation, oxygen is great for the beer. Yeast loves oxygen, so that's gonna help kickstart that fermentation process as well. After our beer is completely fermented and we're getting ready to package it, we wanna keep as much oxygen out of the beer as possible. But for now, oxygen is a good thing. So I got my yeast packet here. I sprayed it with my sanitizer. I got my scissors here, and I got them soaking in some sanitizer. Okay, this is an extra careful step for that. I always sanitize my yeast packets and my scissors as well, because again, we don't want any bacteria or anything messing up all of our hard work that we just put into this beer. So here we go. It's time to pitch the yeast. We're just gonna sprinkle that right on in there. Make sure we get all those yeast cells. Now for a 2-gallon batch, we really only needed to use about 1/3 of this yeast packet. But again, to measure it out, this yeast packet is about $4. So you can never really overpitch yeast. Overpitching yeast, the only thing it does is cost you money, because I just wasted maybe $2 worth of extra yeast. But for me to save that yeast and to put it away and to use it again later, it's not worth it. So I'm just using the whole pack. So we put that in there. We're gonna take our lid here. We're gonna screw our lid on top nice and tight. So as the beer is fermenting and the yeast is eating through that sugar, the byproduct coming off the yeast is gonna be CO2, carbon dioxide. So we're gonna screw that on really tight. We're gonna put our bung on top of here, and then we've got sanitizer here on our airlock because we're gonna keep all the air out of it now. And we're gonna bring this down into the basement. So if you have a fermentation controlled environment, a lot of brewers use a cooler that they can dial in the correct temperature to keep it at 68 degrees the whole fermentation process. The big brewers and the high-end brewers will use glycol to keep the fermenter chilled down to that specific temperature. For us beginning home brewers, all we need to do is find a spot in your house. For me, it's in my basement. I've got a closet in my basement that stays about 65 to 70 degrees all year long. I'm gonna bring this down there and I'm gonna let it sit for about a week. Now, it only takes probably 3 to 5 days for it to fully ferment, but I always just wait 7 days. So in a week's time, we're gonna come back to this and we're gonna get ready to package it. Thanks for hanging out with me during this brew day today. I hope you tried it out and I hope you enjoy the results of your hard work. See you soon.